I'm going to go ahead and present or introduce our presenter today. It says it is Dr. Joanna Simpson. I have to tell you that unfortunately, Dr. Simpson came down with bronchitis and laryngitis this week, and so she was unable to actually present for us. We do, of course, have many subject matter experts here at Tutor.com, though, and so today we have Tammy Niwedi, presenting for us, and she is a subject matter expert for writing and humanities here at Tutor.com. And so, Miss Tammy, I'm going to go ahead and I am going to pass this over to you and ask you to take it away. There you go.
Hey, thank you very much. So our subject today is essay writing, and of course, writing is both a product and a process. The product is what we submit at the end, but there is a process behind that product. One of the purposes of our webinar today is to emphasize the interconnection between a strong writing product, what we turn in, and a strong writing process, what creates the product. In other words, we need to cover the foundation of that A+ paper that is an excellent writing process. The writing process for products that turn out to be an A+ is very detailed and contains a lot of steps, but it is very doable. We will go into detail with each of these stages in the writing process, and as you can see in the diagram, Tutor.com is here to help with each stage. The stages in the writing process are pre-writing, which includes identifying the product and audience and starting to generate content. We then go to drafting, which includes making decisions about development. And then we get into the fine-tuning, which is ensuring a solid product. And of course, we end up with the final product. Some of these stages can be a little more daunting than others, but none of them are impossible. All we have to learn to do is where to begin and where to go from there. Just getting started can be the hardest part. But if we keep in mind that we must be engaged, we can have a good starting point and then eventually a more solid product. If you have a choice in what to write, you'll always want to choose a topic that interests you. But if you can't choose, you'll want to try to keep an open mind because you can still create a solid product even if it's not your favorite topic. There are many, many topics that are assigned by different writing instructors, and the information that can go into those topics can be very engaging and wonderful, even if we don't immediately think it's something that interests us. So if we get to choose, that's wonderful, but if we have to stick to what we're assigned, we can try to make it the best essay that we possibly can. We want to be sure not to skip steps during the writing process. Just like we can't bake bread without kneading or proofing, we cannot write a paper without following the steps. If we bake bread without kneading or proofing, we end up with very flat, stale bread. So when we write, if we skip steps, we too will often need to start over. For instance, we can't go directly to the drafting stage or leave out the editing stage. We must stick with the plan and follow the steps. The next thing that we have to be aware of in the writing process is timeliness. We have to create a timeline and work schedule and stick to those. If we don't, we cannot turn the paper in on time. We may be forced to skip steps if we don't follow the timeline, which can result in lower grades or missing deadlines. The first step that we can begin with is pre-writing. With pre-writing, we have to determine what our product is to begin with. Do we need to write a formal research paper? Is it a literary analysis? Are we doing a lab report? We will often have to research what this type of paper requires. Not all papers use the same type of language, sources, or formatting. So it's important to be aware of what type of product we're trying to create. We also have to determine our audience. We have to be sure to use appropriate language. 12-year-olds won't understand medical terminology, and a doctor wouldn't want us to speak as if we were writing a children's book. So we have to know how to communicate well with our audience. We also have to know how to appeal to our audience. Will they want to hear anecdotal evidence, the stories from our past, the stories that someone else has told? Will they want data complete with statistics and graphs? What will work best to engage our audience in reading our papers? We also need to know if we are speaking to a scholarly audience or just the general audience, and whether we need to write in very formal language or if informal language is best. The next thing that we can do is brainstorm about what content we will include. What is the theme or the expected result of the paper? We can start by forming ideas about the material. We can create a research question and then follow that to figure out what ideas we can form, what information we'll have to gather. And we do want to make sure that we form a research question first and not a thesis, because we want to research to answer the question, not support our own opinions. We answer our research question and then form the thesis from the information that we gather. So, do any of you have any problems with the pre-writing process? What usually ends up being the hardest part to address?
Oh, that's a great question for the audience, Tammy. You guys, why don't you go ahead and use the question box and tell us, what do you feel is the hardest part of this pre-writing process? Sometimes just getting started is where we all get stuck. We'd love to hear your thoughts on that. And while you're putting those in, we did actually have a question come through. With some of our attendees, English is their second language, and they struggle just writing 1 or 2 paragraphs. It takes quite a while to do. While we're waiting for some other responses, Miss Tammy, do you have any tips or suggestions for those whose English is their second language?
I think when we learn any language, and I remember myself when I was trying to learn French, the best thing that I did was just write a lot. Even if it's not grammatically correct, just getting it onto the paper and then working with a tutor or someone who can help you work out the fine-tuning is the best thing that you can do. People generally understand when you're speaking a language that is not your native language that you won't write it perfectly. So just getting those ideas on paper and doing your best is the best way to begin, even if it's a little bit of time consuming, and someone can usually help make sure that the parts you're not so sure of end up being perfect.
I think that's a great suggestion. Just, you got to get started, and then you can learn from errors there. And just for those of you that may be on the webinar where English is your second language, you should know that our tutors are trained in working with English language learners. And for some programs, we actually have English as a second language as an option, where you can connect with a tutor that will specifically work with you and your needs for grammar and vocabulary and writing from the ESL perspective. So All right, that was a great answer. Now, we did get a lot of responses actually from folks about what the hardest thing is in the pre-writing process. And I got to say, I'd agree with every single one of them. We have, let me just read some of these off so everybody can get a feel for this. Finding it difficult to understand what the professor wants sometimes, getting clear instructions. We also have writing the introduction, developing an appropriate thesis title. Where to start is just usually very challenging. Oh my goodness, I agree. The hardest part for somebody else is, again, the thesis, going back to that. And then we also have creating a roadmap to narrow down and define my research in time, so that the scope of the paper doesn't swallow us, or does the scope of the paper narrows down and doesn't sort of eat us all up. I agree on that one. Forming the question first. Tend to automatically think of the hypothesis first on that one. Getting started in proper formatting. So, and then we also have another question. What do you do if your idea isn't stable? Like you want to take this side and also the other side. So I would assume that that would be for folks maybe writing a persuasive essay. And so that's a good question. How do you go about that if it's not? If you can't choose your position?
Well, I think generally one mistake that we make as writers is believing there are only two sides. There are oftentimes many facets to an argument, and it actually is an argument to say that both sides have valid points. Now, your instructor may tell you that you have to pick a stance. And in that case, even if you don't necessarily agree with one side, it's okay to kind of play devil's advocate and pick that side and choose how you would argue that stance if that was what you believed. It makes it a little more difficult and a little more challenging, but you can definitely go from there.
Yeah. Yeah, I also think it's a good learning experience to have to argue something you don't necessarily agree with, because you have to go out and do the research and find the facts. I think that's a great exercise for it. And that leads into another comment here that we have. Christopher feels that sometimes the research just takes so long, and it turns out that some of the research done or some of the things coming back that he's found isn't valuable, and it feels like a waste of time. So do you have suggestions on how to be maybe more efficient or effective in your research?
One of the best things that I found when I was an undergraduate and I had to do a ton of research was when I look up the search terms through the databases. And I find some article that seems to coincide with what I'm researching. Most of those articles have the abstract that you can just plainly see before you click and download any PDFs or buy any material. You can just read through the abstract and get an idea, is this article really what I want? Many times you'll find it's not, but that's okay, because a lot of abstracts also contain keywords across the bottom, and you can use those keywords as further search terms so that you can find more articles. It really kind of cuts through the time of trying to read every single article all the way through. Even to skim an article, if they're 80 pages, can be a lot of time. So that's kind of what I always did, was just try to get a glimpse before I actually devoted time to reading an entire article.
Okay, so using those abstracts and keywords they provide. What about using sources within those sources? Do you ever like if you have an article and you're reading through it and it has its own works cited or bibliography, do you ever search through those as maybe a way?
Absolutely, because a lot of times there's only a portion of the article that's really useful. And you don't want to take the article out of context, but you did find that they cited someone else and that article might be useful. So you can definitely look up what that person had to say, because that may prove more useful than your first article you were reading.
Okay, excellent. So we got some more comments in here, and I think we definitely have time to go through these, but we have a lot more to cover in our presentation. But let me just read out a few more of these, as they're very thoughtful. So we also have a comment, if the paper is broken up into parts, part 1, 2, and 3, should you plan out all 3 parts in the beginning, or should you think of each of them as separate papers?
I think definitely for the flow and continuity of the paper, you have to plan that out ahead. Just like you wouldn't leave your home and travel across country and not have a solid plan, you would definitely want your paper to have a solid outline, especially if it's going to be big enough that it contains different parts. You would want an outline for that. That may change as you work, but I would definitely have a good solid start, or what I was going to start with.
Okay. All right. And we also have another suggestion. There's some other educators in the webinar, which is fabulous as well. And one of the suggestions we got from Robin is that just remember that every word you put on the paper now during your pre-writing process and the beginning stage is a word that you don't have to write later. And so take those notes, brainstorm. Don't necessarily cross something off the list right away, because it could lead you somewhere else. So do the work in the beginning, and it will definitely make finishing your final paper easier. So also, somebody else is saying, I think I try to skip steps and do not donate enough time, we all do, to actually doing the pre-writing stage. And that may be why she has trouble. And definitely, I think if you skip that, skip the pre-writing, it makes it so much harder. Do you have advice for those who like to jump ahead, other than, no, do the pre-writing? Why is this so important?
It actually saves you a lot of time. You think that you're jumping ahead, going ahead, drafting your paper, until you get into the final stages and you realize, well, now I'm going to have to start over. Mm-hmm. So if it saves you time. And it keeps you organized. You'll actually get the better grades by sticking with the pre-writing exercises, just simply because the paper will flow logically. Everything will fall into place. Everything will support your thesis. It's basically, when you write an outline, you're writing a small version of your paper. And it takes very little time then to write your draft once you have the outline, because you're just going to fill in the blanks.
Yeah. Okay. Those are good. I still have about 10 more on here, but one of them that I want to ask has come up a couple different times. And after we ask this one, I think that we should move on a little bit because it may address some of the other questions. But we're looking for some differentiation between an abstract and a theme, research question, introduction. Those 4 things all sort of come before and summarize it all, but how would you differentiate those 4 pieces? Abstract, theme, research question, and introduction.
The abstract is basically an overview of the entire paper. It's going to tell you why the person wrote the paper, what kind of research was included in the paper, what important themes that it's going to cover. It's basically hits on all of those other things in a shortened version. I think it's like 250 words or something like that. So it's a paragraph as opposed to several paragraphs. The introduction is just an introduction to the topic and does not necessarily include the really important things like what type of research was used to form the ideas or what conclusions. It won't necessarily have all of that. It just tells you this is the topic and this is what the paper will lightly cover in the thesis. It doesn't give you the very specific information that the abstract does. A theme for the paper is just what the paper is about. So that if you're researching, the theme for the paper can be helpful, but it's not as specific as the abstract. And then, of course, I think was the other thing that you asked about the thesis.
Mm-hmm.
Okay,
Well,
the thesis is
thesis and research question. What's the difference between thesis and research question?
Your research question is is basically what you're going to research about. It's not your stance. It's not what your paper will cover. It's just the question of why is buying a dog not a viable option? You know, and then you're going to research, and then you're going to form your thesis that says, you know, while some may believe buying a dog is A, B, C, adopting a dog can be X, Y, Z. It's your stance and the supporting evidence that you're going to use to support your stance.
All right, excellent. So you take that research question and almost flip it around into a statement instead of a question.
Exactly.
Excellent. Okay. I see lots more questions coming in. We're going to get back to those, you guys. I promise. I love all the questions, but I want to let Miss Tammy continue with the next section of the writing process as well. So, Tammy, if you want to go ahead and take us on to the next slide, that would be great.
Okay. So the next thing that we will begin to do as we write is to gather information. There are a couple types of sources. We have primary sources, which are like the book that you might be reading, like Mary Shelley's Frankenstein or the Declaration of Independence. You could have approved editions, like the Hamlet edition or the syllabus, for example. We also have secondary sources. You need to be sure that you choose credible sources. That also means that you have to avoid blogs, someone's Facebook page, or a Wikipedia source, because those are not credible sources. Those are highly opinion-based, and they can also contain a more bias than actual fact. They are not peer-reviewed, so we don't rely on those kinds of secondary sources as credible sources. But the kind of secondary sources we need to look for, our authors should have some kind of special holding. Their doctors, their researchers, they're people who have submitted their articles for peer review. And that's why we mentioned specifically peer-reviewed publishing. And what peer review actually means is once that article is sent for publication, a group of these people's contemporaries look over the information, decide whether or not it's credible, and should be published. And if they don't think that it should be published, it will not be published. We use a lot of peer-reviewed journals, like Papers on Language and Literature or Journal of General Practice. Those kinds of sources will be better for your research or for your writing. We can look at different kinds of websites, like the URL ends in .org or .gov to contain statistical information or solid information for us to use. Most instructors will want you to look through a database for journals and articles for your peer-reviewed sources. And part of the content that you will include in your paper is definitely the sources that you're using, but we want to be sure to also include a combination of your arguments and your analysis of your sources, not just taking information from the sources and copying it into your paper. Your instructors will want you to synthesize instead of just repeating what you've read, because anyone can copy the information, but we need to say why it's important or how it's relevant and answer questions to integrate that into the paper. And so once we've done that, I will say that while you're gathering information, it's a good idea to put any kind of quotations, paraphrases, data, statistics into your outline, and go ahead and include the citation information. And I would also keep a separate list of citation information with the full citation written out, so you don't lose all your hard work that you're going to need later when you cite your paper. And I think that's a very important part of being organized, which is what we will cover next. Mm-hmm. In organizing, the type of product determines if there's a predetermined form, like a lab report might have to be in a specific format, or something like a review of literature or an annotated bibliography. Your instructor may say it needs to be specifically written in APA, MLA, ASA, and whatever type of citation that you're using, and they're going to want that to look a certain way. Less structured organization are like literary analysis or a general research paper, and you have more fluctuation, although for your citation forms, your instructors may ask you to use specific citation for those. We do have some tools that we can use to organize, and as I mentioned, one of those is a formal outline, and that's really important, especially for longer projects, because it's very hard to stay organized while we're writing those types of projects. And before we get to the formal outline even, we might use a visual organization tool to connect ideas or themes, types of evidence, types of rhetorical devices, or whatever it is that we're covering, because those two can be hard to keep organized when we're writing. So what is the hardest part of organization and gathering materials that you can think of?
You guys, what's the hardest part of being organized? That's a good question. And while that's going out, I'm going to read out a few of the other questions that have come in. One that I think many people are wondering is, how old can a resource be? Is there a rule, something like no older than 5 years, or does it vary?
We do generally want to stay 5 years and less to stay current. There are some types of research that you might do that do require older sources. If you have to research linguistics and find out, the etymology of a word, and you can't do that in a current paper necessarily. It may have to be older historical documents from the government, things like that may be very pertinent. But since research is so fluid and it changes so often, generally speaking, if something is more than 5 years old, it may not be relevant or current in your writing.
Excellent. Okay. And then we had a question going back to the pre-writing step. And actually we can combine with this with some of the other questions. There seems to be a concern about the amount of time our students are spending on the writing process. It feels like it's taking so long. Now, I remember when I was in school, one paper the teacher would have us do in an entire semester. It took the whole semester because we did break it down. But we have folks asking, how much time should you spend on the pre-writing step? And can you write 1,000-word paper in one day? Things like that. And even for native speakers, it feels like it's taking too long. So maybe some advice or encouragement in terms of the length. And it is a long process.
It really is a long process, and by all means, if need be, you can write 1,000-word paper in one day. But generally speaking, it's nice to kind of break it into smaller chunks, just like you can't eat an elephant in one bite. You take a little bit each day, and you say, okay, well, today I'm going to do pre-writing. Tomorrow I'm going to, start working on some of the other steps. And you just do a little bit each day. And it doesn't seem so daunting. When you sat at your computer for 8 hours writing one paper, it seems like you've been there for 40 years. So it's nice to break it into smaller parts. And as you practice, I think the process becomes a little more, I don't want to say normal, but comfortable. It doesn't seem so mechanical, and you tend to flow with it a little better, so it doesn't take quite as long.
Okay, great. And then we had two comments or questions that have to do with grammar. So I'm going to lump these two in together a little bit. One is wondering if there is an easier way to improve grammar in writing, and they want to know, do teachers take grammar seriously? I'm sure the educators on here would say yes. But then the other question is that Ben finds it hard not to go back and correct spelling and grammar in the pre-writing stage. So how can you sort of get out of that mindset? And when do you take a look at grammar?
I think a lot of teachers take grammar very seriously, but as we're writing, we have to remember in the pre-writing stage, nobody's going to see that. That's just for us. So if we ask even for a tutor's help, we can even ask them to overlook the grammar mistakes just to concentrate on content or whatever. It's really hard habit to break. It was hard for me not to go back and go, oh, I forgot a comma, or oops, that's the wrong verb. But once we work through that and we realize that we're going to cover that all again at the end of the paper, when we've put the whole draft together, we're going to start fine-tuning and working through correcting all the grammar and mechanics. And it will be wonderful at that point. But in the pre-writing stage and the drafting stage, if we start correcting grammar, we're kind of wasting our time, because we may end up having to change things for content and rewriting portions of it anyway.
Okay. And that's great advice. And we have one more that came up about grammar. And this is a great question. And again, those that are teachers and professors, as well as Ms. Tammy, I'd love your thoughts too, if you could answer this. One student was recommended by an instructor to use Grammarly.com, and she's wondering whether that's a good program to use for papers. Is anybody on here familiar with Grammarly.com from an educator standpoint? Okay, I'm seeing some yeses coming through. Great. Would you guys recommend it to your students? It's good. Okay, Grammarly is a good source. Yes. So, Emily, it sounds like your instructor was on course with that one. So Grammarly.com, for those other students in attendance, sounds like a good resource that you can use to sort of overcome some of those grammar issues. Then we also had another comment that I think is very important to just share with the group from Professor Lori. She cautions us that the .org websites may not always be reliable. And she gives a really good example. She says, while an organization has to prove who they say they are to be a .edu or .gov site, there's no restriction for the .org. And her example is that MartinLutherKing.org URL was actually purchased by a former Ku Klux Klan member. And the King family has not been able to do anything about it. And so we do need to use, I think, some common sense and maybe some cross research as well. And so, Professor Lori, thank you for sharing that. I think we all tend to go to the .orgs thinking an organization, nonprofit, great. So that's a good reminder. Before we continue with the presentation, I wanted to read out, we had asked them about organization, and we got a few responses on that. So I'm going to share those, and then we'll go ahead and keep going. Robert says that keeping citations together is a struggle or a challenge in organization, but he has discovered that Microsoft Word has a built-in citation tool, and also Google Docs has a plug-in citation that helps keep organized. So if you guys use Microsoft Word or Google Docs, maybe check into the help menu about citation organization. You might find a great tool there. And then Ashley agrees, staying on topic is probably the hardest part of the organization process. And I think many of us would agree with that too. So we're going to keep going. I know you have some more information to provide, and I'll just keep watching these questions as they come in.
So once we've organized and have our outlines or whatever it is that we're going to use, the next part that we will work on is drafting. We will draft, of course, the introduction and thesis statement, body paragraphs, and topic sentences, and those will include charts and graphs if we're going to include those. And then we'll also draft the conclusion. But we don't necessarily have to do any of this in a particular order. Some writers prefer to write the introduction last. All writers kind of develop their own techniques, so we don't have to stick with a stringent writing structure as far as that is concerned. If you feel more comfortable putting together your body paragraphs and then writing in your conclusion and then going back and making sure that your introduction and your thesis fit the paper, then that's completely fine. As we covered before, when we're drafting, we don't really want to worry about being grammatically correct. We will go back and fix all of that later. You don't have to show anybody any of these, any of your draft. You can keep it to yourself if you don't want people to see that you've missed a comma. Something that's really important as we're drafting, though, is to stick with the schedule, but don't be afraid to take a break. If you get frustrated, tired, your eyes are crossing, you don't know what to write next, then it's important to kind of get up. Well, make sure you save your file first, but then get up, take a walk, do some yoga, or even take a nap to avoid getting writer's block. Because once you've completely stressed yourself out, you may not know what actually comes next. So I find that physical activity kind of helps clear your mind a little bit, just to take some of the stress away and take your mind off of what you're doing. So it's good to do those things. And writing can seem really scary, but it isn't quite as scary if you're prepared. So you'll definitely want to be sure not to skip the steps that we've covered and be familiar with your topic. If you haven't researched well, drafting isn't going to go so well. So you'll want to be familiar with your topic and have all your reference material handy. So whether you've saved files, printed out pages, or you have books, you want those by your side as you go into the drafting process. A lot of people do begin drafting with a thesis statement. So we will cover some things about writing a thesis. A thesis statement is the roadmap to your paper, as you will hear many people say. It should be strong and provide a sense of how the essay will be developed including subtopics. You can see examples of the strong thesis statement at the top. We do want to speak our stance concisely, and we'll include at least the 3 subtopics that we will cover. So a not so strong thesis may begin with very vague language, and you'll want to make that more specific because readers really need to get a good idea of what your paper is going to cover. Something to keep in mind is every thesis is a working thesis until you've submitted the paper. So you can always go back and change your thesis if your evidence does not support or it changes. Just like if we were on a trip and we had to take a detour, we would need to change our map. And we do the same when we write. If our information changes, if we decide to take something out of the paper, we can't leave that in the thesis if it doesn't belong. So we may have to rewrite the thesis maybe more than once, and that's perfectly acceptable, unless, of course, your instructor tells you otherwise. You can always change your thesis. Another important point about thesis writing is you want to avoid things like in this paper or I will talk about. Those are sort of, they go without saying that you're going to talk about them, so you don't need to say that you will talk about them. You do see some differentiation in higher level writing where they say in this paper, but generally speaking, through high school and college, we would not say in this paper, I'm going to talk about this. We want to be more concise and use our words wisely because when we write, every word carries a lot of weight. So we need to change or choose the words that we're going to use so that they carry the weight that they need to. We have to remember that every one of the body paragraphs should support the thesis. So if you know right away that your body paragraphs go off in a different direction or don't necessarily support the thesis, you either have to change the body paragraphs or change the thesis. So do you have any questions about writing a thesis? I know that's really hard. Introduction and thesis can be the hardest parts of the paper. So what gives you the most trouble when you write a thesis?
All right. I'm looking to see what we have here. In thesis writing, can we copy exactly our thesis statement from the introduction into the conclusion?
We actually would not want to do that. You do want to summarize what you've talked about, but it's really frowned upon to just copy the exact thesis back into the conclusion. We don't ever really want to restate anything word for word. There's no need to be repetitive that way.
Okay. Also, we have a question. How would you start a thesis? And also, how would you rewrite the thesis point in each body paragraph?
Well, beginning a thesis, I generally want to start that with my stance on the topic. I may, if there is opposing viewpoints, I may say something like, while some people believe this, research shows this, and, go from there.
Okay.
To copy that into the body paragraphs, you'll use a little different terminology in your thesis statement. So if I was writing a thesis statement about school uniforms, for example, I might say something like, school uniforms should be used in school because they aid with affordability. Yeah. I don't know words. That's my problem. I'm a writer without words. They aid with affordability, acceptance, and tolerance in school, for example. And that's just off the top of my head. So please don't use that as your thesis statement. But then in my body paragraph, instead of saying affordability, I might immediately go into the first body paragraph explaining how some families have difficulty affording name brand clothing, and a school uniform might make it easier for them to access purchasing the school clothing for their children. So it's just to reword that a little different, again, not doing anything verbatim, staying away from repetition, but still supporting the thesis.
Okay. I'm going to read out just a couple more comments on this topic, but I know that we also need to get into the conclusion and fine tuning. And two of the different comments that I'm seeing in here actually sort of contradict each other from different educators. And so one thing I want to point out for sure is to always follow your instructors' guidelines and their instructions, because depending on the type of assignment and the level of assignment, there could be different rules. And so they're always going to be your best guide in terms of what to expect. So we hear that, it's not a good idea to start a thesis statement with, I am going to talk about blah, 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 or in this paper. But one of the other educators feels that that is okay to use in some topics, because especially when you're drafting, because it's clear and it identifies the statement as a thesis as well. So definitely listen to your instructor's guidance and their instructions for the paper as well. And so the other one that I wanted to address on here, and some of these we may not get to just because time is running a little short, but can you just clarify, a thesis statement can be broken up into 2 sentences? Is that correct? Or does it have to be in one?
I think sometimes a thesis statement could be 2 sentences for sure. It just depends. Some instructors will tell you that it must be 1 sentence. And like you just said, we always want to go by what the instructors want. Mm-hmm. That supersedes anything that anyone else will tell you. If your instructor says it must be 1 sentence, it must be 1 sentence. But sometimes there is the occasion that you could use 2 sentences if you need that space to say what you need to say.
Okay. All right, great. So if we have time for the rest of the questions as we go along, guys, I'm going to get back to those other thesis questions. But for now, Ms. Tammy, could you go ahead and take us through the section on conclusions and fine tuning, which is another question that actually came up.
Sure. So for the conclusion, as I said, we don't want to just repeat what you've already said. You want to give a brief summary of main points. You want to use different languages, or different language, not languages, to cover your thesis. And you also want to kind of synthesize everything for your reader. You need to talk about the so what? Why does this matter? What are the implications of the subject? How will it affect the world, the country, or even just the neighborhood? If you start to kind of put that into a neat little package at the end of the paper, and it kind of puts a little bow on the paper and ties things up. We want to avoid bringing in new topics or new sources that we haven't covered. This is just bringing everything to the fine point. And so you think about the introduction starts out very broad and goes very narrow, and the conclusion kind of starts very, very narrow and kind of goes a little more broad with the bigger implications, but it puts the little bow on the paper, so to speak.
Okay. All right. Should you include some parts of your introduction in the conclusion?
Yes, you can talk about what your thesis statement covered. You can say that in different words. Again, we want to avoid repetition, but you can definitely talk about some of the things that the introduction spoke on.
All right, wonderful. And then we did actually have a question on here, and this is a great lead-in. What's fine-tuning?
Fine-tuning is sort of like waxing your car. It's pretty good, but you want to get all the extra dirt off of it and just make it polished and shined so that you're ready to show it to everybody else.
All right, and I think we have a couple slides on that one. Will it advance for you? There we go.
Yes, there we go.
Perfect.
So when we're fine-tuning, we can start asking questions like, does the paper support the thesis? Should I change the thesis? Does the introduction have a hook at the beginning? Do the paragraphs flow logically and smoothly? Does the content fulfill the instructions or prompts? Do my sources support my stance? Are my citations correct? Are my sources credible? From there, we can work on to editing grammar and mechanics, and looking over the paper more than once is a perfect idea. You know, you're never really done until you're done. So I sometimes have worked over a paper more than 10 times. And then one fine-tuning tip is that don't feel bad for needing to revise your paper. All professional writers work with a team of editors, beta readers, proofreaders, people to ensure that their paper is ready for publication. So just like if you take your car to the car wash and a bunch of people come out and wash it and wax it, that's what folks like we, the tutors, are for. We help you fine-tune your paper and make sure that it's ready to go. A lot of times asking for help is a great idea because another set of eyes can see issues that we don't see ourselves.
That is so true. So true. So let me just check. We only have about 4 more minutes, you guys, and I do see some other great questions in here. We may not get to them all. So what I would really like to do is show you where you can get those questions or how you can get those questions answered. So Ms. Tammy, could you go ahead and flip the presenter back over to me?
Sure.
All right. Okay, so the majority of you that are attending have access to Tutor.com. And it is accessible to you at no cost. And so we definitely encourage you to use it. It is there to help you. And a lot of these questions that I'm seeing, you know, how do you write a hook? Are there resources that students can use to use more mature words? Things like that. Fine-tuning your grammar. Our Write tutors are available to help you with those things and to dive even deeper into each of the different topics that we have. We have 2 different options in most programs, whether you're using it through the military, through your school, or maybe through a library, employer. 2 different ways you can typically get help with writing. One is in a live one-to-one session with a tutor. On demand, you can don't have to schedule it, just hop in, choose writing, and get connected with one of our tutors. For some of the questions you guys are asking within the webinar here that we're not getting to, that is a great way to get your answer. I definitely encourage you to connect. You don't have to have a paper for them to review. You can go in and ask a question about general writing strategies. When you are working on a paper, though, and you're going through these many different drafts that Ms. Tammy was talking about, you can use our drop-off essay review, where you upload the paper. You don't have to connect in person or, you know, online in real time with the tutors. You upload it. You let them know through a questionnaire what you would like them to look at and what you need help with, and then you'll receive feedback and guidance within 24 hours, okay? So you have your drop-off and your live writing help. Again, for that live writing, just come in and choose Write Tutor, Essay. If it gives you a great option, go ahead, do that, enter your question, and connect. You can even upload your paper to go over it with the tutor in here. For the drop-off, it's going to be called something like submit your essay or drop off your paper up on the top. And when you do that, let me jump forward. When you do that, here we go, submit a paper for review. We're going to ask you some questions. Be as specific as you can because that's going to help the tutor help you. Okay, so answer these questions, tell us your type of citation, any instructions your instructor gave you. So when do you use each one of these? What's the best one to do? We're going to go through, oh, you get it back through my sessions, but there's this big green note on there. Believe me, you can't miss it when your paper's ready for review. So when do you choose each one? Brainstorming stage, organization, and the outline writing stage. We really suggest you do those with a live tutor. When you come to the outline, you could do a drop-off, but in that pre-writing, which gives us all so many problems, we definitely recommend the live one-to-one discussion and interaction with the tutor. Once you get to the drafting stage, and especially the fine-tuning stage, you can use whichever one you're more comfortable with. Our live tutors or real-time tutors will go through your paper with you, certain paragraphs with you, give you guidance, have you go back, make some revisions and bring it back to us. We'll help you do those different drafts, or you can upload it and ask for the type of feedback you want. So, but in those beginning stages where we had so many questions about pre-writing, hop online, get connected with one of the tutors and get the help you need because it doesn't cost you guys anything. You get the service, it's available for you through your school or your library, as I mentioned, or through our military family programs. And we definitely want to be able to help you out, okay? So to end it, to wrap it all up, hopefully not too far past the hour, keep calm and write on, okay? And know that we're here to help you and that many of the questions that we're seeing come through, just about everybody else on the webinar is feeling them too. So you're not alone. And we'll support you every step of the way through that full writing process. So thank you guys again for joining us. If one of your questions went unanswered, go ahead and log in with one of our tutors. They're standing by ready to answer.